You open the fridge, and something in the back smells wrong. You don't need to see it. You don't need to touch it. Your whole body has already made the decision before your brain even finishes the thought. Don't eat that. Your nose wrinkles. Your stomach turns. Some ancient alarm system fires off inside you before you've even named what triggered it. You assume this is just common sense. You assume any animal would react the same way to spoiled flesh. But the real answer is far stranger than common sense, and it starts with a bird that does the exact opposite of everything your body just told you to do. A vulture lands on a carcass that has been sitting in the sun for 3 days. The meat is bloated. It is leaking. It is crawling with bacteria that would put you in a hospital bed within hours. The vulture doesn't hesitate. It doesn't gag. It tears in head first, sometimes burying its entire skull inside the body cavity, and it walks away from that meal completely fine. No fever, no infection, no trip to an emergency room. That same carcass, if you so much as touched it and then touched your mouth, could kill you. So what does a vulture have that you don't? And why did evolution build you to recoil from exactly the kind of meal that keeps another animal perfectly healthy? The answer isn't just about strong stomachs or tough birds. It's about a war that has been running for millions of years between meat and the microbes that break it down, and about which side of that war your body was built to fight on. Humans and vultures took 2 completely different evolutionary paths through that war, and understanding why reveals something strange about your own biology, your own history, and even the disgust you feel every single day without ever questioning it. Start with the acid. Your stomach is already acidic. It sits somewhere around a pH of 1.5 to 3.5, acidic enough to dissolve a lot of what you swallow and kill off plenty of bacteria before they ever reach your intestines. That number, pH, is just a scale scientists use to measure how acidic or basic something is, and lower numbers mean stronger acid. Battery acid sits near 0. Pure water sits at 7, right in the middle, neither acid nor base. Your stomach at 1.5 is already closer to battery acid than to water. That's how your body handles most of the bacteria riding in on your dinner. A vulture's stomach acid sits near pH 0. That's not just a little stronger than yours. On the pH scale, each whole number represents a 10-fold jump in acidity. So a vulture's stomach isn't twice as acidic as yours. It's closer to 100 times more acidic. It is acid strong enough to dissolve bone. Researchers have documented vultures swallowing bone fragments whole and having them essentially melt away inside the digestive tract. That level of acid doesn't just kill the bacteria living in rotten meat. It obliterates almost everything, bacteria included, before it has any chance to cause harm. Your stomach was never built for that job. It was built for a completely different diet. And that difference goes back further than you might expect. But acid alone isn't the whole story. And this is where it gets stranger. In 2014, a team of researchers sequenced the genome of the turkey vulture and the black vulture, comparing their genetic code to other birds. What they found wasn't just strong acid. They found specific mutations in genes tied to the immune system, the network of cells and proteins your body uses to detect and destroy invaders. Vultures showed alterations in genes responsible for recognizing dangerous bacteria, essentially tuning their immune system to tolerate bacterial loads that would send your immune system into overdrive. Your immune system reacts to threats like botulism or salmonella with inflammation, fever, and sometimes catastrophic overreaction. A vulture's immune system, shaped by millions of years of eating exactly what killed almost everything else, has learned to stay calm in the presence of toxins that would otherwise be lethal. That same 2014 genomic study also compared vultures to closely related birds that don't scavenge, birds that hunt live prey instead of feeding on carcasses, and the contrast was striking. The scavenging vultures showed measurable differences in genes tied to gastric acid secretion, essentially genetic instructions dialed up to produce more corrosive acid than their non-scavenging relatives ever needed. That's a critical detail because it means this wasn't some general trait shared by all birds of prey. It was a specific adaptation that evolved because scavenging demanded it, in the same way your ancestors' smaller jaws and shrinking guts evolved because cooking made a different set of demands. Evolution doesn't hand out extra defenses for free. It only builds what a specific way of life actually requires, and for millions of years, nothing about the human way of life required a stomach capable of dissolving bone. And then there's the gut itself, which might be the strangest part of this entire story. Researchers swabbed the facial skin and gut contents of vultures feeding on carcasses and compared the bacteria they found on the outside of the bird to the bacteria that survived inside it. The outside of a vulture's face, after a meal, is teeming with the same dangerous bacteria found in the rotting flesh itself, things like Clostridia and Fusobacteria, groups of bacteria responsible for some of the deadliest food poisoning outbreaks in human history. But by the time that same meal reaches the vulture's actual gut, most of those dangerous strains are gone. Something inside the vulture is filtering out the specific killers while letting a curated, specialized community of gut bacteria thrive instead. Scientists still don't fully understand every mechanism behind that filter, but the evidence is clear that a vulture's internal ecosystem has been shaped, generation after generation, specifically to handle death as a daily meal. Yours hasn't. Why would it? You were never supposed to eat this way in the first place. There's also a simpler layer sitting underneath all of this, one that has nothing to do with acid or genes and everything to do with chemistry you can actually smell. When flesh decomposes, bacteria break down the amino acids inside muscle tissue, and two of the byproducts of that breakdown are compounds called putrescine and cadaverine. The names alone tell you what scientists thought of them when they were first identified. Putrescine comes from the same root as putrid. Cadaverine comes from the same root as cadaver. Both compounds are chemically distant cousins of ammonia, and both are responsible for a huge portion of that unmistakable rotting smell you recognize instantly, even as a small child who has never taken a single biology class. Your nose didn't need to be taught what those molecules mean. It already came preloaded with the answer, tuned by evolution to treat that exact chemical signature as a 5-alarm warning. A vulture's sense of smell barely reacts to those same molecules the way yours does, because a vulture was never built to avoid them in the first place. It was built to seek them out. That distinction matters because it isn't just vultures that feed on the dead. Hyenas will also tear into carcasses well into decomposition, and their jaws and digestive systems carry their own version of extreme resistance, including bone-crushing bite force and a gut environment tuned to handle heavy bacterial loads most predators would never risk. Komodo dragons were once famously believed to kill prey with an unusually dirty, bacteria-laden bite, though more recent research has shifted toward venom as the primary weapon, alongside a digestive system still built to tolerate a level of bacterial exposure that would be catastrophic for you. Across every one of these species, the pattern repeats. Whatever the exact mechanism, animals that regularly interact with dead or dying flesh have independently evolved their own specialized defenses against it, again and again, in completely unrelated branches of the animal kingdom. Humans are one of the very few mammals on Earth that never developed any of those defenses at scale. And once you understand what your ancestors were doing instead, that gap stops looking like a weakness and starts looking like a trait. That's the part worth sitting with for a moment. You didn't fail to evolve vulture-strength stomach acid. You evolved down a completely different path, one that didn't require it, and that path is arguably the more remarkable story of the two. Go back far enough, and your ancestors were, at least partly, scavengers too. Early hominids living on the African savanna 2 million years ago weren't apex predators. They were opportunists, and the evidence for this sits in fossilized bones covered in cut marks that overlap with tooth marks left by lions and hyenas. That overlap tells a story. Something else killed the animal first. Your ancestors arrived afterward, stripped whatever meat and marrow remained, and moved on. That's textbook scavenging behavior, and for a stretch of evolutionary history, it may have been a real part of how early humans survived. So if scavenging is in your ancestry, why didn't your stomach acid evolve to match a vulture's? Because your ancestors found a shortcut that a vulture never needed. Fire. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham built an entire theory around this moment, sometimes called the cooking hypothesis. The idea is straightforward once you hear it. Cooking meat does chemically, outside the body, roughly what a vulture's stomach acid does chemically, inside its body. Heat breaks down proteins. Heat kills bacteria. Heat makes food safer and dramatically easier to digest, extracting more usable calories from the exact same piece of meat. Once your ancestors controlled fire, they essentially outsourced the job of decontamination to something external, a flame, instead of carrying an internal furnace of stomach acid strong enough to melt bone. And that trade-off had consequences that shaped the entire trajectory of the human body. Cooked food requires far less digestive machinery to break down than raw food does. Over generations, human guts shrank. Human jaws shrank. Human teeth got smaller, and the energy that used to be spent maintaining an oversized digestive tract got freed up for something else entirely. Some researchers argue that energy helped fuel the growth of an unusually large, unusually expensive organ: your brain. The human brain burns roughly 20% of your body's total energy at rest, an extraordinary cost for an organ that makes up only about 2% of your body weight. Something had to pay for that. Cooking may be one of the biggest reasons you could afford it. The timeline behind this shift stretches back roughly 1,000,000 years or more to a species called Homo erectus, whose fossil remains show smaller teeth and a smaller gut cavity than earlier hominids. Right around the period when the earliest solid evidence of controlled fire starts appearing in the archaeological record. That's not a coincidence anyone is comfortable calling a coincidence. A body evolves toward whatever the environment actually demands of it, and once cooking became reliable, a body built for grinding down tough raw tissue for hours every day stopped being necessary. Smaller jaw muscles meant less pressure on the skull, which some researchers believe may have even loosened physical constraints on brain growth itself. None of this happened because early humans set out to become smarter. It happened because a species that used to spend enormous amounts of energy chewing, digesting, and fighting off whatever pathogens survived, a raw meal suddenly didn't have to anymore. That freed up energy didn't just vanish. It got reinvested, generation after generation, into a brain that could plan ahead, remember which foods were safe, and eventually pass that knowledge down as language instead of instinct. So here's the trade your ancestors made, whether they understood it or not. A vulture kept the internal defenses and never needed fire. Your ancestors built external defenses, fire, and later food preservation, and eventually rules passed down through culture, and let their internal defenses soften over time. Neither path is more or less evolved than the other. They're just two different strategies for solving the exact same problem: staying alive long enough to reproduce in a world crawling with microscopic killers. But knowing the trade-off doesn't fully explain the danger, and understanding what's actually growing inside spoiled meat makes the stakes far clearer. Rotten meat isn't dangerous because rot itself is some mysterious poison. It's dangerous because it becomes a breeding ground for specific bacteria, each with its own method of hurting you. Take Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria responsible for botulism. It thrives in low-oxygen environments, which is exactly what you get inside a sealed carcass or inside improperly canned meat. It produces a toxin considered the most lethal substance known to science, so potent that a few nanograms, an amount too small to see without magnification, per kilogram of body weight can kill an adult. It works by blocking the signals your nerves send to your muscles, and in serious cases, it can shut down the muscles you use to breathe. Vultures encounter this toxin constantly, feeding on carcasses in exactly the conditions where it thrives, and their bodies handle it without issue. Yours would not. Or take Clostridium perfringens, one of the most common causes of food poisoning tied to improperly stored meat. It produces toxins that attack the lining of your intestines, causing the cramping, diarrhea, and violent digestive distress that anyone who has ever had food poisoning will recognize instantly. Add salmonella, which can trigger fever, vomiting, and in severe cases, bloodstream infections. Add listeria, particularly dangerous for pregnant women because it can cross into a developing fetus. Each of these organisms represents a different strategy for hijacking a body, and rotten meat is essentially a buffet where several of them are growing at once. A vulture's stomach acid and specialized gut bacteria can shut most of them down before they cause harm. Your body has almost none of those same defenses left, because your ancestors stopped needing them the day they learned to cook. History offers a strange case that shows just how quickly these bacteria can turn a routine meal catastrophic. In 1985, an outbreak of listeriosis traced back to soft cheese in California sickened dozens of people and killed several, including newborns whose mothers had eaten the contaminated product during pregnancy. Investigators eventually traced the source to a specific batch where the pasteurization process, the controlled heating step designed to kill exactly this kind of bacteria before it reaches you, had failed at one point along the production line. That single mechanical failure, one heating step running slightly short, was the entire difference between a safe product sitting on a grocery shelf and one capable of causing fatal infections. It's a small, almost mundane detail, but it captures something essential about this whole story. The gap between safe and lethal in anything touched by decomposition is rarely dramatic. It's usually a matter of degrees, a few minutes of heat, a few degrees of temperature, a few days of timing, and human bodies have almost no built-in tolerance left to absorb a mistake in that margin the way a vulture's body would. This is where the real danger of rotten meat becomes less mysterious and more mechanical. It was never really about the smell itself hurting you. The smell is just the early warning system your body evolved to notice before those exact bacteria get anywhere near your bloodstream. There's a piece of history that shows exactly how badly things can go when that warning system fails or gets ignored. In 1911 and 1912, Douglas Mawson's Antarctic expedition faced brutal food shortages, and members of the team were forced to eat their remaining sled dogs to survive. Some of them ate the dogs' livers, and within days they developed splitting headaches, peeling skin, and progressive organ failure. One member of the team, Xavier Mertz, died from it. The cause, identified decades later, was hypervitaminosis A, a toxic overload of vitamin A concentrated at extreme levels inside the livers of Arctic predators. Sled dogs across the Arctic have known through instinct for generations never to touch that organ. The men on that expedition had no such instinct, and it cost at least one of them his life. Indigenous Arctic communities had understood this danger for centuries before science ever gave it a name, passing the warning down as tradition rather than chemistry. That's culture doing the job your ancestors' bodies could no longer do alone. And this pattern shows up again and again throughout history, long before anyone understood bacteria or toxins by name. In the 19th century, doctors in Europe and America described a condition they called ptomaine poisoning, blaming certain chemical compounds found in decaying meat for widespread cases of food-related illness. The specific chemistry behind their theory turned out to be mostly wrong. Ptomaines themselves aren't usually the actual toxic culprit, but the underlying instinct behind the theory was correct. Something in spoiled meat was making people violently ill, and doctors were racing to put a name to a danger that human bodies had already been sensing and avoiding for tens of thousands of years without a scientific explanation at all. So if rotten meat is this dangerous, and your body has so few internal defenses left, how has any culture on Earth ever safely eaten something that's technically breaking down? Here's where the story takes its sharpest turn, because the answer isn't that humans avoid decomposition entirely, it's that humans learned to control it. Think about the foods already sitting in your own kitchen right now. Cheese is, at its core, controlled bacterial and fungal decomposition of milk. Yogurt is the same process applied even earlier in that transformation. Sauerkraut and kimchi are vegetables deliberately broken down by specific, carefully selected bacteria. Soy sauce, miso, and natto all come from mold, and bacteria transforming soybeans into something almost unrecognizable from where they started. None of these foods are raw and unchanged. All of them are, on a molecular level, decomposed. So why don't they kill you the way a rotting carcass would? The answer is competition. When you ferment food correctly, you're not preventing bacteria from growing. You're deliberately introducing a specific, chosen strain of bacteria or fungus in overwhelming numbers, giving it ideal conditions, usually a very particular level of salt, temperature, or acidity, and letting it dominate so completely that dangerous bacteria never get a foothold. It's the same underlying principle a vulture uses inside its own gut, a curated community of microbes crowding out the killers, except humans learned to do it outside the body first in a barrel or a jar or a smokehouse, instead of relying on stomach acid alone to win that fight internally. Iceland has one of the most extreme examples of this anywhere on Earth. Hakkarl is fermented Greenland shark, and fresh Greenland shark meat is actually toxic when eaten raw, packed with compounds related to trimethylamine oxide that would make you seriously ill. Icelanders discovered, generations ago, that burying the shark meat and then hang-drying it for months allows those toxic compounds to break down into safer byproducts, transforming a poisonous fish into a food that's been part of Icelandic tradition for centuries. That's not humans defeating decomposition. That's humans learning to steer it using time, chemistry, and inherited tradition as tools your ancestors developed specifically because their internal defenses had already softened. Inuit communities in the Arctic developed something remarkably similar with iguanak, a traditional method of fermenting walrus or seal meat by burying it and allowing controlled fermentation to occur over weeks or months. Done correctly, following exact methods passed down through generations, it produces a nutrient-dense food that sustained communities through brutal winters where fresh meat wasn't always available. Done incorrectly, without that precise traditional knowledge, it carries a real risk of botulism, the exact same toxin found in poorly handled carcasses. The margin between nourishment and death in that process isn't wide, and it isn't guesswork. It's precise, tested, generational knowledge, refined over hundreds of years specifically because the science behind it wasn't available yet. This isn't ancient history either. Public health agencies in Alaska have documented botulism outbreaks tied directly to traditional fermented foods within living memory. Cases where a batch was prepared slightly outside the traditional timing, or stored at a temperature just a few degrees off from what generations of practice had established as safe. The outcome in those cases wasn't a stomachache. It was hospitalization, sometimes requiring a ventilator to keep a patient breathing while the toxins grip on their nervous system wore off. That statistic matters because it proves this entire external immune system your ancestors built isn't foolproof the way a vulture's biology is foolproof. A vulture doesn't need to remember an exact number of days. Its body simply handles the threat automatically, every single time, without conscious effort. Your version of that defense depends entirely on information being passed down correctly, generation after generation, and if that chain of memory ever breaks, even briefly, the safety net underneath it breaks too. Sweden has its own version of the same high-wire act called surströmming, a can of fermented Baltic herring so pungent that opening it is often done outdoors, sometimes underwater to contain the smell, and the fermentation process is deliberately allowed to continue right up until the moment the can is sealed, meaning pressure builds slowly inside as bacteria keep working. That smell isn't a warning sign that something has gone wrong, it's actually a signal to someone who grew up around the tradition that the process went exactly right. Ancient Rome had its own version too, called garum, a fermented fish sauce made by packing whole fish with salt and letting them break down in the sun for weeks, producing a pungent, savory liquid so central to Roman cooking that entire commercial operations existed solely to produce and export it across the empire. Modern fish sauce used throughout Southeast Asian cooking today follows a nearly identical process, refined independently, thousands of miles away, using the same underlying principle. Controlled decomposition, guided by salt concentration and time, produces something safe and flavorful. Uncontrolled decomposition produces something lethal. The line between the two isn't about whether decay is happening, it's about who is steering it and how precisely. That's the deep irony sitting underneath this whole story. You don't have a vulture's stomach acid anymore, but somewhere along the way, your ancestors built an entire external immune system out of salt, smoke, time, and memory. Instead, one so effective that it eventually produced foods people crave rather than merely tolerate. This same pattern of externalizing what a vulture does internally shows up again in one of the more surprising corners of food history. In the late 1700s, the French government offered a substantial cash prize to anyone who could find a reliable way to preserve food for soldiers on long military campaigns, largely driven by Napoleon's need to feed an army far from home without everything spoiling in transit. A confectioner named Nicholas Appert won that prize by discovering that sealing food inside glass jars and then heating them killed off the organisms responsible for spoilage, effectively inventing the process behind modern canning decades before anyone understood bacteria well enough to explain why it worked. He didn't know about Clostridium botulinum. He didn't know about pH or pasteurization in any scientific sense. He simply tested, failed, adjusted, and eventually landed on a method that worked, then handed that method down exactly the way an Inuit elder might hand down the timing for a batch of fermented walrus meat. The danger that method was quietly solving didn't get a name until decades later, when a German physician named Justinus Kerner spent years documenting a mysterious illness linked to poorly prepared sausages, describing paralysis, breathing failure, and death in patients who had eaten meat sealed without enough acid or heat to stop the exact toxin discussed earlier. The word botulism comes directly from the Latin word for sausage, a small detail that quietly reveals how much of this story runs in a straight line from ordinary kitchens to laboratories. Long before anyone could isolate the bacteria under a microscope, cooks and preservers across Europe were already fighting the exact same threat a vulture handles internally every day, using salt, heat, and acidity as their version of 100 times stronger stomach. Now here's the part that connects all the way back to that moment at your fridge, because your disgust reaction was never a coincidence. And it wasn't invented by accident either. Researcher Valerie Curtis spent years studying disgust across dozens of cultures, and her conclusion reshaped how scientists understand the emotion entirely. Disgust isn't a random, arbitrary feeling. It's a behavioral immune system, evolved specifically to keep you away from things statistically likely to carry disease, long before your actual immune system would ever need to fight anything off. Curtis and her collaborators ran studies asking people from wildly different cultures, different continents, different religions to rate how disgusting various images were. Across every single population tested, images associated with disease risk, bodily fluids, decaying flesh, visible parasites, scored as universally disgusting, regardless of culture, language, or upbringing. That consistency is the signature of something built by evolution rather than something taught by a specific society. Think about what that means for the moment you opened that fridge at the very beginning of this. Your nose didn't need to identify Clostridium perfringens by name. Your stomach didn't need to calculate botulinum toxin concentrations. Something deeper and faster than conscious thought recognized a pattern, that specific rancid, sulfurous smell associated across thousands of generations with sickness and death, and it made the decision for you before you even had time to consciously decide anything. That reaction, the wrinkled nose, the recoiling stomach, the instant refusal, is the same evolutionary lineage as the vulture's stomach acid. Different tool, same underlying job. Keep dangerous microbes out of the body before they can do damage. A vulture solved that problem with an internal furnace of acid strong enough to dissolve bone. You solved the same problem with an emotion so fast and so automatic you rarely even notice it happening. Psychologist Paul Rosen, working alongside Curtis in this same field, spent decades studying exactly when and how that emotion shows up in human development, and his findings add another layer to this story. Very young children don't actually show strong disgust toward decaying or contaminated food the way adults do. Toddlers will happily put almost anything in their mouths, food that has touched the floor, food mixed with things it shouldn't be mixed with, without the visceral recoil an adult experiences automatically. That reaction develops gradually, usually somewhere between the ages of 4 and 8, as a child's brain matures and social learning reinforces an instinct that was already present in a more primitive form. This tells you something important. Disgust toward spoiled meat isn't purely hardwired from birth like a reflex, and it isn't purely cultural either. It's a partnership between an ancient, built-in warning system and a layer of learned reinforcement laid on top of it by parents, culture, and direct experience. Exactly the same partnership that let your ancestors combine an instinctive wariness of rot with specific, hard-won knowledge about which foods needed fire and which needed months of careful fermentation. And that's really the twist sitting at the center of this whole story. It's easy to look at a vulture eating a rotting carcass and think of yourself as the fragile one, the animal that lost some evolutionary arms race, the species that can't handle what another species handles easily. But that framing misses what actually happened. You didn't lose a war against decomposition. Your ancestors won a completely different war, one fought with fire, with fermentation, with inherited knowledge passed down as warnings and traditions instead of as acid concentration. A vulture is a magnificent, highly specialized survival machine built for exactly one narrow job, and it does that job better than almost any other creature on the planet. But it can't cook a meal. It can't ferment cabbage into something that lasts through winter. It can't pass down a story to its children warning them, the way an Inuit elder might, about exactly how many weeks a piece of meat needs to sit before it's safe. Your species built an entirely different kind of defense, one made of culture instead of biology, and that defense turned out to be flexible enough to let you eat almost anything on Earth as long as you first learn the rules someone else already tested for you. Consider how much of your daily life is still quietly run by this same inherited system, even in a world of refrigerators and printed expiration dates. Grocery stores stack meat behind glass at controlled temperatures specifically to slow the exact bacterial growth your ancestors once managed with salt pits and smokehouses. Refrigeration itself, invented barely over a century ago, is really just a mechanical way of buying more time before decomposition sets in, the same goal Nicholas Appert was chasing with heat and sealed jars centuries earlier. Your modern kitchen is, in a very real sense, a museum of solutions to a problem your body stopped being able to solve internally the moment your ancestors picked up fire. Every rule you follow without thinking, cook chicken until it's no longer pink, don't leave mayonnaise out in the sun, throw away a dented can, is a distant descendant of exactly the same trial and error that taught someone, centuries ago, exactly how many weeks a buried piece of walrus meat needed before it turned nourishing instead of deadly. That's really what's happening every single time you check an expiration date on a carton of milk. It's what's happening when you instinctively press down on a piece of chicken to see if it feels slightly slimy before you cook it. It's happening when you smell milk straight out of the carton before pouring it into your coffee without even thinking about why you're doing it. You're not running some outdated, broken safety system. You're running the exact same defense that let your ancestors expand from a single narrow region in Africa into literally every environment on the planet, from Arctic ice to equatorial rainforest, because they learned to test, to remember, and to pass down which foods needed fire, which foods needed salt, which foods needed months of careful fermentation, and which foods, no matter what, needed to be left alone entirely. So the next time you catch that smell drifting out of the back of your fridge and your whole body recoils before you've even opened your eyes to look, you're not witnessing weakness. You're witnessing the end result of a defense system built from cooking fires, salted meat, buried fish, and thousands of years of trial and error passed down through people who didn't have microscopes but somehow got the science right anyway. The vulture never needed any of that. It kept the ancient tool of pure stomach acid sharpened over millions of years into something almost supernatural. You traded that tool for something arguably more powerful: knowledge, memory, and the ability to hand a warning down to the next generation before they ever have to learn it the hard way. None of this means you're weaker than a vulture or that evolution shortchanged you somewhere along the way. It means your species solved the exact same ancient problem using a completely different toolkit, one built from memory instead of muscle, from culture instead of acid. And that toolkit turned out to be flexible enough to carry humans into every corner of the planet a vulture's biology alone could never have reached. A vulture can eat almost anything dead, but only the dead. It has no way to preserve a harvest for winter, no way to safely transform a poisonous fish into a delicacy, no way to warn its offspring about a specific organ to avoid based on something that happened to a stranger 100 years earlier. You carry all of that quietly every time you walk past spoiled food without a second thought. You open the fridge, and something in the back smells wrong. This time, you understand exactly what that feeling actually is. It isn't your body failing you, it's 10,000 generations of trial and error, whispering the exact same warning a vulture never needed to hear at all.